I'd like to welcome you back to another broadcast of the Crossbanner Heritage Movement. You can pick us up on Facebook or you can watch us here on YouTube. The Crossbanner Heritage Movement has a simple twofold mission. Number one, we are evangelistic. That is, we are here to proclaim the gospel of Christ Jesus, to lead the lost to the redemptive cross. And number two, we are exhortative. We desire to educate others to the founding principles and the historical heritage of our American Republic. Now this summer, what I want to do this summer is I want to offer, I'm well aware, I've been in education for 15 years, I am well aware that there are a generation or two anymore out there who do not read at all. And so what we want to do this summer, we're going to do a series of book reviews. I know there's just not that many people out there reading anymore. And so I want to take a couple of books this summer, books that I like, books that I believe are very good books, the subject matter, and they're very important to what's going on right now. And so I want to do a couple of book reviews this summer. And what I want to do is tie the events and the historical persons in those books to contemporary issues. The first one that we're going to do today is Fatal Purity. Fatal Purity, Robespierre and the French Revolution. It was written by Ruth Skur and it was published in 2006. Now, if you're a student in high school or a student in college, then you may remember who Robespierre is. Maximilien Robespierre. He was a revolutionary in the French Revolution, which began in July of 1789. Now, quickly, as a bit of background, on page 6, it talks about the pre-revolution French economy. France had involved itself in two wars, Louis XV and Louis XVI. Louis XV brought them into the 7 Years' War, or what we in America call the French and Indian War. That war was lost by France, and it was won, remember, by the British Empire, of which Americans, colonists, were part of the British Empire. That war devastated France. A generation later, the grandson of Louis XV, Louis XVI, is now king, and he brings France into another war with the British, and that war was the American Revolution. Now you say, Brother Derek, I thought the American Revolution was good. Yes, for America it was great. We got our independence. But for France it was terrible. Although they were on the winning side and the British were defeated, America got their independence, the French got nothing. It bankrupted their economy and destroyed their country. So, the combination of two wars, one that they lost, one that they won, and getting nothing out of it, bankrupted their country. Then there was the matter of what is called in history the Little Ice Age, and that devastated some wheat crops, and bread was their staple crop. So, the economy was bad leading up to the middle 1700s, 1750s, 60s, 70s, and then into the 80s. On page 23, it talks about the chaos in education that they were going through. The Catholic Church was still running the schools, still running the universities, but they were in the process of pushing them out in some areas because, and it was twofold. Number one, what was good about the Catholics in the schools? Well, what was good about the Catholics in the schools is that because of the use of the Bible as a textbook, the religious influence was providing a moral foundation to the French people. Let me say that again. The Bible as a religious influence was providing a moral foundation to the French people, historically, Western civilization, Christianity. That was always true. However, the Jesuits were beginning to be seen as evil in their conduct. They were amassing great wealth, they were lording it over their flocks, and they were accused of perverting young boys. So there was chaos in education. There was chaos in the economy. Now that eventually led to the July 1789 storming of the Bastille, page 94. Page 94. The people got up their wheel. They were tired of the economy, tired of being left out politically with the vote, and they stormed the Bastille. Now the Bastille was a combination military arsenal and a prison for political prisoners. Now, my students at school always find that to be a very strange combination. Why were they storing weapons in a prison? I don't know the answer to that, but that's the way it was. So the people overran it. Now, while the guards and the captain of the guard did fight back, they were overrun by the people. And here is where the trouble begins. The people that took over, the new revolutionaries that took over the Bastille, chopped the heads off of the governor and the captain of the guard and put their heads on pikes and paraded them through the streets of Paris until finally casting the heads into the Seine River. Now that is very different than the American Revolution. I want to tell you, there were some similarities to the American and French revolutions, and there were some differences. And that's what we're talking about here today. Now, on page 100 and 101, crossing the line, they began to kill members of the nobility just because they're rich, and eventually members of the clergy because they were Catholics and running the amassing great amounts of wealth, accused of perverting young people, and they were part of the elite. And so the revolutionaries, being the middle classes and down to the poorest of the poor, they saw them as a threat. They saw them as the source of all their misery, and so they began to kill them. Now, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin both spent time in France. Before the Revolution, during the Revolution, after the Revolution. And that is where Jefferson's quote during the French Revolution, that is where his Tree of Liberty quote comes from. And Jefferson said he sees this bloodletting, and he says the Tree of Liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is a natural manure. And so what I, and many of you, when you begin to hear this, they're killing the rich simply because they're rich. They're killing the clergy, the members, the leadership of the church. These are excesses. Cutting the heads off of men and parading them on pikes. These are excessive. We call this radical. I would call it radical. But Jefferson saw this as a necessity. And Robespierre now Robespierre grew up in a rural area, eventually was educated, went to college, became a lawyer in his hometown, and before the Revolution he was elected as a deputy to the Estates General, which was their parliament, like our Congress. Now, the line is crossed when again they begin to murder. And the guillotine is invented, and the guillotine is introduced because they thought it was more humane than shooting people or hanging people. It was instant, and it seemed to be painless, and so it was used. And so I would say they began to cross the line. Jefferson, we know his Tree of Liberty speech. It seems that Robespierre at times was uncomfortable with the bloodletting, but eventually he began to see it as a necessity to get France where they needed to be. Now, at this point in time, they've written the Declaration of the Rights of Man, they've written a constitution, and they've gone from being an absolute monarchy with a king that had all power to being a constitutional monarchy, more on the lines of the British monarchy. But the king had hired a finance minister to try to fix the problems of the economy. His name was Jacques Necker. And two things happened during this period of time, 1790-91. Moderates are still in control, although there is some bloodletting. And what happened was two things. One, Jacques Necker got fired. The king thought he was being too pro-populous, too pro-poor, and not taking care of the advantages of the elites, and so he was fired. And number two, there was a story that came out of the palace at Versailles about 35-45 minutes outside of Paris, where Louis XIV had built this magnificent Paris, and Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the Queen, were living there. There was a story that came out of the palace, out of Versailles, to Paris, that spread throughout Paris, that the king and the queen had given a party, and that they had taken the new tricolore, the new flag of France, and thrown it on the floor and trampled on it. And so these two stories, the firing of the finance minister, who was beloved by the people, and the story that the flag, the new tricolor, had been thrown on the floor and trampled, that caused a group of women this time on 105. I did want to read you this quote. On 105, the book says, it was men. Men had captured the Bastille, wrote the historian Jules Michelet, but it was women who captured the king. A group of women known as the fish ladies, these were women who worked in the fish markets. They went out and attacked the palace, tore down the gates. The soldiers this time did not want to fire on the crowd, and they were killed, and they were beheaded, and the king and the queen were brought from Versailles back to Paris. Now, on 122, 123, it talks about the future of Christianity. Eventually, they're going to take the 4-day week of 12 months that we know of as the calendar today. They're going to convert it into a three-week, 10-day calendar. And the purpose of that was to erase Sundays. So you would not know the day to go to church, and you would not know the day of worshiping Christ. They began to tear down churches. They began to kill more of the elites, of the nobility, and more of the rich, and more of the priesthood. Marxism. This is about the time that Marxism becomes, this is before Karl Marx, but the ideas of Marxism are already being seen. And the next stage, you go from the moderates to the radicals, because the king is put to death. Eventually the queen is put to death. And the question, what is democracy? What is democracy? Well, was it enough to be a constitutional monarchy? Eventually, and this is what they say about the king on 244, 245. 244, 245, real quick. Robespierre said, Louis must die because the nation must live. Now, they had been in favor for some time of a constitutional monarchy, but now he has gone over the line. He has fired the finance minister. He has trampled on the flag, supposedly. He's put on trial. He's found guilty of treason, and the king is put to death. Later, the queen is put to death. And we go through that period of time called the Terror, and then the Great Terror. The king is put to death. The queen is put to death. They're beheaded by the guillotine. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of nobility, rich people, just because they were rich, were put to death. Members of the clergy, the leaders of the church, bishops, priests, they were put to death. And eventually, and let me close with this today, eventually, the revolutionaries began to eat their own, because the radicals began to put to death other revolutionaries that were seen as too moderate. Even in the end, Danton, who was a good friend of Robespierre, they had served together for many, many years in the revolution, and even Danton was put to death. The final thing that they tried to do was to completely eradicate Christianity. And they moved to a festival of the Supreme Being. They did away with Christ, with Christianity, and went to the festival of the Supreme Being with a goddess of reason. And Robespierre appeared in a toga as the high priest of this new religion. Finally, the day came when Robespierre would come to the Parliament, the convention now, and he would bring these lists of traitors to be put to death. And finally, one day, he shows up with a list, and he says, there's the list of the next set of traitors. And I'm not going to give you the list today, but I'll give you the list tomorrow. And the men there in the convention began to think in their head, we could be on that list. He could be putting to death anyone. And so the next day when he brought the list, they arrested him. And he was put on trial for treason. He attempted suicide by shooting himself in the face. The bullet did not go through his brain. It shattered his jaw. And on 357, 358, where we see the scene where he shows up that day to be guillotined himself, the man who was carrying out the sentence decided to rip the bandage from his face that was holding his jaw together. And with that scream, that primal scream, Robespierre goes to death as well. I want you to get the book. I want you to read the book. Again, it's called Fatal Purity, Robespierre and the Revolution, the French Revolution. Until next time, this has been the Crossbanner Heritage Movement.